Unit 2, Area Study 1, Adaptations of Organisms. Chapter 13 is the one that we're going to start with, which is Environmental Factors and Adaptations. So in this particular chapter, we're going to be looking at environmental factors that determine where organisms live. When it's talking about organisms, it's talking about both plants and animals, and it's important for you to keep that in mind. Adaptations of organisms enable survival, reproduction, and use of resources. Adaptations is changes, long-term permanent changes to an organism, and that these adaptations can be structural, psychological, and behavioral. The questions that you need to do for this chapter are questions 1 to 14 throughout the chapter and 1 to 12 for the chapter review. Alright, so let's get started. The challenge of survival. So what this part here is talking about is what organisms need to be able to not only survive themselves and grow, but to reproduce to ensure their organisms' ongoing survival beyond just them. So the things that they really need are what are underlined here. So they really have to have nutrients. We're talking about carbohydrates here, that's their food sources. They need water, they need oxygen, and carbon dioxide. Here we're looking at cellular respiration and photosynthesis, and then you need conditions around these organisms to promote their survival. So here we're looking for things like temperature and light. Every organism has a different tolerance range to the changing of those levels of things that are required. The tolerance range just refers to the amount of variance that it's able to survive when it is changed. So the environment that these organisms are living in provides all of those things that we were just talking about. The environment provides those essential requirements, those basic requirements that we were just talking about to sustain life. The environment that the organism is in needs to be able to supply all of those things, or the organism isn't going to live. Now, there are two different components to the environment, and here we're looking at the abiotic and the biotic factors. So the abiotic factors are the physical surroundings of that organism, and they're known as the non-living factors. So things like housing come into those non-living factors. Rocks come into non-living factors. Those kinds of things. The biotic ones are the other organisms, so other living things. Those two together, the biotic and the abiotic, are what make up the environment for these organisms. So here in this slide here, you can see the different examples of biotic and abiotic. So you need to remember quite distinctly that biotic means living factors and abiotic means non-living factors. So anything that was alive and is now dead, so here on this far left one here, far right, sorry, with all the dead trees, that is a non-living factor. Sunlight is a non-living factor. Water is a non-living factor. Living factors, we're looking for things like bacteria, other plants and animals that organisms are dependent on to be able to survive. So for us, a biotic factor would be the bacteria that is in our gut. A biotic factor would be any animals or plants that you consume. And then an abiotic factor would be our housing, our cars, those types of things. I've got a question here and we're going to have a quick look at it. It says, in a school laboratory, an aquarium was set up. The glass tank was given a sand and gravel base as well as some larger rocks to provide shelter for inhabitants. It was then filled with fresh water. A long-necked turtle, small fish, and different types of freshwater algae were then released into the tank. An external light source set on a timer was set up and a large filtration system was installed. So that part there gives you background information that you need to know to be able to answer these two questions. So A says, define abiotic factors, and this and is very important. The and is what separates this 2-mark question. So 1 mark would go towards defining an abiotic factor, and the other mark goes towards giving an example from the situation above. So they've listed lots of different things that they've done in this environment. All you need to do is give one example of an abiotic factor. The second question says name a biotic factor. So that would be worth 1 mark. And again, it's breaking it up for you so you can clearly tell what each mark is going towards. Describe an effect an abiotic factor has on it. Remember that the biotic is living and the abiotic is the non-living. This is really essential to help you be able to answer this question. So for the first part, so for A, you just need to give a simple definition and one example. It's not asking for you to list 3 or 4 or 5. It's only wanting one. B, name a biotic factor, a living factor that's added to this environment, and how any abiotic factor, it doesn't need to be the one that you mentioned earlier. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say describe how the abiotic factor listed in A affects the biotic. So you can use any abiotic factor that you want. So this question in total is worth 4 marks. So you should be looking to spend about 4 minutes on that. What I want you to do is pause the video, spend 4 minutes answering this question, come and show me your answer, and I will let you know what areas you need to look at to improve it. Alright, so I'm assuming that you had a go and you answered that question and you didn't just keep going. What we're going to be looking at now is environmental factors and how these limit species distribution. What it's talking about in terms of species distribution is the spread of an organism over areas. So the distribution of it around a certain area, around Australia, around Asia, that kind of thing. What it is saying here is that any one environmental requirement can be, any number of them can be limited. And if one of them is, that is determined to be the limiting factor. What the limiting factor does is it affects the survival and reproduction of the organism. So if you don't have enough oxygen in that particular environment, that oxygen would be the limiting factor. If you didn't have enough water in that environment, the water would be the limiting factor for that organism. And again, we talked about tolerance ranges before. So different organisms within that environment may be able to sustain different tolerances of that level of change. So where some things might be able to survive with less oxygen, other things might not. And if things aren't able to survive, then those organisms will not inhabit that environment, that specific area. So then their distribution, so their ability to live in certain areas will decrease, and therefore it can reduce and make a lot smaller the area, the total area that these organisms are able to survive in. So that's what it's talking about in terms of distribution and how these, if you limit these factors, it can have a large effect on where these organisms are actually able to live. So again, we're talking about tolerance ranges here, and it can be determined for those environmental factors that we were talking about before can be a factor of it, and it can also be affected by the physiological, behavioral, or structural adaptations of these organisms. And we're going to get to that quite soon, looking at the physiological, behavioral, and structural adaptations. All that it is saying here is that an organism's tolerance range is affected by that organism's ability to cope with that change. Okay, so if an organism is better suited to being able to say, like if we're talking about fish, for example, if a certain fish is able to be more effective at removing oxygen from water, then when there is less oxygen in the water, that fish has a higher chance of survival because it is quite efficient at what it does. A fish that is less efficient at removing oxygen has a smaller tolerance range and therefore will be less effective at ensuring its survival in that environment. So here we're looking at tolerance ranges. You need to be able to interpret graphs. So on the y-axis up the side here, we're looking at population density. So how much of an organism or how many of that particular organism are surviving within an environment. The top one shows only one species, where the bottom one shows several species. So what it is telling you is that every single line on the graph represents a different organism, and the optimum range for survival is where you've got the most of those organisms being able to survive. So this purple line here, its optimum range, its peak population is outside the optimum range of its environment for other organisms. So that species isn't suited to that particular environment, but it may be suited to other environments. Okay? All right. So what we're going to be looking at is different types of environments, and there are different factors that are going to be coming into play in certain environments. So obviously, if we are in a desert, for example, the main thing that's going to be influencing an animal's survival is water ability. So that is going to be the limiting factor. Okay? The same thing would go if you're on a forest floor. You need to remember that there's lots of the canopies of the trees are going to be reducing the light intensity for plants at the bottom of the forest floor. So they need to be adapted to survival with less light. If you're looking at a pond down the bottom here, the dissolved levels of oxygen are quite important. So the ones on the right, the key environmental factors, these are the ones that would be the limiting factor towards organisms in those particular environments. This chart here comes from your Heinemann 1 textbook, and it just gives you 3 different examples of 3 different organisms that require different things. So it lists for you the abiotic factors and the biotic factors of their environment, but it also talks about the things that they need. So abiotic factors needed by those organisms. So the house sparrow, for example, the first one, needs a shelter, nest sites, and temperatures above freezing. So this type of bird couldn't live at the top of a mountain where it snows in winter. They couldn't live there in winter, for example. If there were no trees and branches for it to build a nest, that organism couldn't live there. So if you're looking at the seal, if there's no water, it's not going to be able to survive. It needs solid ice near the coast. So if it was looking to live in the tropics of Queensland, it's not going to be able to survive because it needs ice. It needs ice, and it needs that near the coastline for it to be able to survive. So these these organisms are all adapted to get what they need from their environment. If it was a different seal, for example, that seal might not be able to survive in those Arctic temperatures, whereas this particular wetted seal can. So this one is in your book. You can have a look at that again to get some more information. Alright, what we're going to start looking at now is the adaptations. So you need to know the definition down the bottom here. An adaptation is an inherited characteristic that increases the likelihood of survival and reproduction of an individual organism. An adaptation is a long-term change. It is not just something that you change for a week or a month. Okay? So an adaptation for us wouldn't be putting on jumpers in winter. That's not an adaptation. It's not a long-term genetic change that we're making. Okay? And we also talked about earlier the 3 different ways that we can adapt. There's the psychological, which is the functional. There is the anatomical, which is structural changes. And then there is also the behavioral. Okay? So the psychological here, we're looking at when you're choosing to gather food and those kinds of things. The anatomical is the structure of a bird's wing. Okay, so if we have a look at this slide here, again, it's going into some more detail. You need to make sure that you're not confusing the word adapt with acclimatize. So we acclimatize to the cold by putting on jumpers. Okay, so the acclimatizing to something is short term, adapting to something is long term. And we have these adaptations because of the process called natural selection. So what happens with natural selection is genes that are better suited to achieve a particular goal or survival within that environment, they're the ones that are more likely to be passed on to the next generation. Those with genes that are not supported by the environment are more likely to not survive to the stage of reproduction. Okay, so natural selection is the process of passing on genetic information that is better suited to that animal's survival in its environment. So it passes on those particular characteristics to the next generation. All right, so here we've got those adaptations again. So the physiological, the functional, so these adaptations are related to the actual functioning of that organism. So for example, if you are a sprint runner versus a endurance runner, a sprint runner has a lot more muscle mass, and it's to do with generating particular muscle fibers, versus a long distance runner where they need to be quite slim and they've got more of a different type of muscle fiber. Okay, people that exercise a lot have a better efficiency in their cardiac system, so their hearts can be stronger. Structural is anatomical, and these are related to the actual organic structure of the organism. So you could have different wing shapes, for example. Behavioral is anything that the organism does involving an action response to a particular stimuli. So here the picture is of a bear sleeping through winter, for example. So that would be a behavioral adaptation. The bear can't survive out in the cold in winter, so it hibernates over that period of time. All right, another example here that we have is Darwin's finches. So what Charles Darwin did was he traveled around and documented a lot of different things. And he went to the Galapagos Islands and he studied all these different types of finches. And he proposed that all of these finches originate from one finch. And they have all had changes to their beaks to suit the type of food that they are eating. And not too long ago, so in about 1982, there was a drought on the Galapagos Islands, and during this period of time, the people that were there researching noticed that there was a trend towards larger beak sizes. And they noted that this wasn't sustainable because young birds weren't able to survive as long with these larger beaks. So it wasn't a sustainable adaptation for these organisms to have in that particular time. But the other thing that they were saying was that the environment changes quite regularly. So while they've adapted to an environment of drought for a certain period of time, that drought isn't going to last forever. And these particular food sources might not last forever either. So that all these finches are able to adapt their beaks determined by what is going on in their environment. So if they're looking to eat seeds, then their beak shape and size would be a lot different to those who are looking to eat insects, for example. Another example that we have is a sea lion. So sea lions here have very strong lungs. Their heart rate is quite slow, so this way they're reducing the amount of oxygen. They've got blubber down the bottom here, which is fat. And what that is doing is it's reducing the amount of energy that the seal needs to have to keep themselves warm. They've got a large amount of blood. Their muscles store oxygen in myoglobin, and their extremities receive less blood when they are diving to try and keep their organs and keep everything warmer. So they're going to reduce heat loss to their environment. So there's just a couple examples for plants. So the sea lion, when it's living in the water, there's a lot of abiotic factors that need to come into play here. So there is pH, temperature, light, salinity, which is the salt. dissolved oxygen, so how much oxygen is actually in the water, the wave action, tidal movements, turbidity of water, which is the clarity of the water, and current flow. I'm not expecting you to remember all of those abiotic factors, but if you're given a question about an organism that lives in water, you need to be able to think about the factors that are going to influence this organism's survival. So is the water warm? Is the water cold? Does it have a high pH or a low pH? Is it salt water or fresh water? All those types of things are going to influence how an organism is able to survive. Okay, I've got another question here for you. The tawny frogmouth is a nocturnal hunter of mammals such as mice, rats, and possums. It will roost in trees during the day where it is perfectly camouflaged, waiting until dusk when it can fly silently in search of food, regularly perching frozen on high vantage points ready to strike. It has many adaptations which make it a successful hunter in suburban backyards. The first question is to define the term adaptation, and this is worth 2 marks. So you need to be very specific in terms of the answer that you would give here. You may be looking to give examples of those adaptations. Okay. B, using the information above or your knowledge, give an example of the following adaptations for the tawny frogmouth and state its advantage. So a behavioral one, what action is the tawny frogmouth doing? Okay, so that's its adaptation. What action is it doing to help it catch food, for example, or avoid predators? So you need to list the behavioral adaptation. So give your example and then state how it is an advantage to do that. So there's 2 things. So the behavioral one would be worth 2 marks, 1 for the example and 1 for the advantage, and the same for the structural adaptation. 1 for the advantage and 1 for the example that you're able to give from the text above. So in total, this is worth 6 marks, 2 marks for each. So I would suggest that you pause the video now, give yourself 6 minutes and attempt to answer these questions. You can come and show me your answers and I'll let you know how you're going. Okay, let's start moving away from animals and let's have a look at a couple of plants. We're not going to go into too much detail because we're going to be looking at tropisms in the next topic. So adaptations of plants. So unlike animals, plants aren't able to move. They're stuck in the ground. So they can't have a nervous system to help them to respond to changes in their environment. So to respond to these changes, they rely on hormones. Okay, so what this hormone system does is it produces chemicals that are messengers, and these messages last longer than our nervous system messages, but they're also a lot slower than our nervous system messages. Okay, so these messages reach their target cells and they either pass over the cell membrane and go into the cell, or they bind to a receptor on the surface of the cell. Okay, and then they trigger a biochemical response within that cell. So whatever that cell needed to do, it is now doing it. If it needed to make something, it's now making it. All right. So these hormonal responses are changes within plants. So if we have here, we've got the response of plants to light, for example, which is what this picture is on the right. And we're going to look at this in more detail in the next topic where we're going to be studying tropisms with more detail. But what it's basically saying is that these hormones are released for different reasons. Sometimes it's light, sometimes it's gravity. There's all different reasons, and they determine how a plant grows. All right, so let's have a look at one particular example, which is the mangrove tree. So mangroves are a type of plant that can grow in the intertidal zone on muddy substrates. So there's 3 things that these mangrove trees have to cope with in their environment. The fluctuating salinity levels. What this means is that the level of salt within the water changes. Okay, so sometimes it can be really salty, sometimes it'll be not salty at all. So it's the changing, oh, that's an I, salt levels. The lack of oxygen for their roots, these trees grow in water. So the roots of these plants can't get as much oxygen as plants can that are growing in the soil above the ground. And then the last one, because it's an aquatic environment, their seed dispersal needs to be very specific because they don't want to drop their seeds and have their seeds sink to the bottom of the water and not be able to grow, or float along and rot, again, not being able to reproduce. So this is what some mangrove trees look like. And in Australia, we mostly have these up in the tropics. If you've ever been up to northern Queensland, you might have seen them there. But these are all mangrove trees, and that is part of their root system adaptation that you can see above the water. All right, so their adaptation to removing salt is two things. They remove salt by actively pumping it out across the membrane at their root surface. So they push the salt out of their roots back into the water, and it's an active process, meaning it involves energy. The other option that they have is that they excrete salt from their leaves. So they're either going to push it out of their roots or push it out of their leaves, one of those two places, and that's how they manage their salt intake. To increase the amount of oxygen that they're getting from their roots, you would have noticed before that their root system, they had a range of aerial roots. So these are roots that are above the surface of the water, and they contain loose corky tissue. So it's basically making it more effective at gas exchange. And by increasing that root surface above the water line, they're increasing their surface area that is exposed to oxygen, and they're better able, because the tide level will change, they're better able to receive as much oxygen as they're going to need. So here you can see that the root system is growing above the tidal line. And the last one was seed dispersal. So the seeds of the mangrove tree can float, and then they've got this viviparity, which means that these seeds pre-germinate before they leave the tree. So they're still attached to the tree and they start to germinate. So that means that they've already developed a root system. So they're on the tree, they're developing their root system, they fall off the mangrove tree, they float in the water until they reach the side of the river, where they then get planted into the dirt and then grow a new mangrove tree along the edge of the river. So that is the adaptations and examples of adaptations for both animals and plants. So that's chapter 13.